Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Take Part's September event. We are so happy to be back doing an event. We missed you terribly over the summer. We hope you enjoyed the self-study programs that we put together for you, but we are super excited to have our speaker, Ms. Guggemos, this evening, and I'll be telling you about her in just a minute. We have a couple of housekeeping things that we need to take care of first. Next slide, please. That's too fast, Randy. The mission of Take Part is to confront racism and to engage in dismantling the systems that perpetuate ingrained racial inequality. We do this through events, education, and outreach that bring engagement in building community where all people are treated with equality and respect. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the presentation and Take Part events are those of the individuals. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Take Part or its members. Tonight's event is made possible in part by the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Portland and by contributions from individual donors like you. We work in partnership with the Association for Human Advancement and Development, and we are so grateful for everyone who contributes to our programs. Thank you very much. We have a few communication agreements that we like to go over before events begin. The first is listen more, and keep listening even when you might be feeling uncomfortable. Engage tension, but do not indulge drama. The acronym WAIT, why am I talking? Make sure you have a good reason to be talking. Consultation and collaboration and not competition. And finally, please maintain a safe space for difficult conversations. Take away lessons learned and insights gained, and leave behind details like who said what. Just to let you know how tonight's program will go, Ms. Guggemos will be speaking for a little while, and everyone's going to be muted during her presentation. If you have a burning question during the presentation, you can put that question in the chat box. So just go down to the bottom of your screen and find that chat button, and that will pop up the chat box. So you're welcome to put your questions in there. The chat box will be monitored during the event. So either one of our team members will be able to respond to your question, or I will forward your question to Eva. At the end of the presentation, we'll open it for question and answers. And at that point, you can use your raise hand function. And if you want to be on video and speak your questions directly at that point, you're welcome to do that. You can also continue to use the chat box if you don't feel comfortable being on video. Also, please keep your comments and questions concise and respectful. So welcome to Life and Death at the Forest Grove Indian School. We are thrilled to have Eva Guggemos presenting with us this evening. Eva is the archivist and an associate professor at Pacific University in Oregon. She has an MA in history from Yale University, a Master of Library Science from Simmons University, and a BA from the University of Kansas. At Pacific, she has led a project to digitize all the university's records related to the Forest Grove Indian School, which later became the Chemawa Indian School in Salem. Her current project is a book on the Forest Grove Indian School. Eva has compiled a ton of information, and in the chat box, we will be including links to websites of Pacific University, where you can see a lot of the work that Eva has done and find a lot more information about the Forest Grove Indian School. We've also compiled a bibliography of additional reading if you want to dive deeper into this topic, and that will be posted in the chat as well. If you want to download that bibliography, you can just click on it in the chat and it will download to your computer. So without further delay, I would like to welcome Eva Guggemos. Eva, thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. That was a very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really honored to be asked to speak. And I'm looking forward to having a great discussion with all of you after I show you a lot of images and talk for a while. So I'm going to go ahead and start my slideshow. Just one moment here. Wait, sorry. Pressed the wrong button there. There we go. All right. So we are going to be talking about something that happened. In some ways, it seems like a long time ago, but in other ways, not that long ago. This school was open at the time when our grandmothers' grandmothers were children. The Forest Grove Indian School was open from 1880 to 1885. And as Donna said, I've been working on a book about its history. We're going to talk today about why the school existed and what it was like to be a student there, and then what we can do to confront its legacy. Before we get started, though, I did want to acknowledge up front something pretty important, which is that I'm coming to this topic not as a native. I'm coming to it as an historian, as an archivist, so basically as an academic. So the viewpoints that I have on this are definitely coming out of that kind of background, and I just want to acknowledge that up front. I'm guessing that we likely have people here attending with us virtually who are Native, who may have personally attended a boarding school, or who have family who did. And I want to just absolutely acknowledge and honor those lived experiences. I'm only going to be able to give you my piece of the puzzle in this, not a complete view. So just to start off with, I wanted to just spend a moment looking at these two images, which are the two most famous pictures connected to the Forest Grove Indian School. And they illustrate a lot of what the school was all about. On the left, the picture that's titled New Recruits, that is a photograph of children from Spokane as they were being brought from Spokane lands to Forest Grove. They're still wearing all of their clothes from home in that picture. On the right, that is a picture of the same group of students 7 months later, after they had been attending the Indian school. I think just from looking at this picture, we can kind of tell what the school was about. It existed in order to extinguish Native culture. It existed in order to teach children to adopt white ways of life. And disturbingly, if you count how many children are on the left versus the right, you'll notice that there is one child missing. And that was a child who died, Martha Lott. We think she's probably the tallest girl who is on the left-hand side of the picture. She passed away before the second picture could be taken, and she is, to this day, buried in an unmarked grave in Forest Grove. But before we get into more detail about what happened at the school, I wanted to back up for just a minute and talk about how the Forest Grove Indian School ever came to be. I think a lot of us were probably taught in school about the Oregon Trail and this kind of myth of how Oregon began. How there were these settlers who were looking for a better way of life and how they moved to the West. But of course, I think we all know this already, that the land was not empty at all. And before they arrived, there were dozens of tribes here in Oregon, dozens of tribes, dozens of languages. There were villages all along the Columbia River, villages on the Willamette, all up and down the coast. And from the coast to the high desert, there was an amazing diversity of cultures, reflecting the many thousands of years that Indigenous people lived here. So I right now am sitting in Forest Grove, and Forest Grove is in the very heartland of Atfalati tribal land. The Atfalati are also known as the Tualatin Kalapuyas. And in the pre-contact time, there were at least 18 villages kind of surrounding Forest Grove. So this map might be a little bit hard to kind of suss out what is going on here, but Portland would be just to the right of this image. And Forest Grove is about 20 miles due west of the center of Portland. So we were really like in an inhabited land. There were probably even more villages than this originally. These are just the only ones whose names we still know. When European Americans arrived, there was a really rapid destruction of Native lives and culture from the very beginning, from when ships very first came into contact with Natives. And the bullet points that I have up here on the slide are definitely an oversimplification of what happened, but just for our purposes today, I wanted to highlight like 3 kinds of destruction of Native culture. And the first is disease, the second is dispossession, and then the third is assimilation. When European Americans came into contact with Indigenous people here in Oregon, the first major kind of destruction came via disease. As soon as ships contacted Native people, diseases passed over. So smallpox, measles, various kinds of fevers, influenza. These are estimated to have wiped out 90% or more of the people who once lived in what's now the Portland metro. Some historians think it was even higher than that, like as high as 98 or 99%. These epidemics came in waves. They came year after year. And so even before large numbers of settlers came to take land, this destruction via disease had already happened. In the 1840s, that is when European Americans began to arrive in really large numbers and began to almost totally dispossess Native tribes of their lands. Again and again, during this time period, Native people were forced to sign treaties. They were rounded up. They were pushed onto small portions of land of what their historic lands had been, or moved to entirely new sites. And by 1880, nearly all the tribes in Oregon had been forced onto reservations. So by 1880, there had been this huge destruction of population, and a fairly complete taking of land had already happened. But assimilation was a harder thing to force. Assimilation, that means making the same. So the idea was to make Native people behave like white people, and ideally to kind of disappear into the white population. But this was a much more difficult thing to accomplish than just sending the army in to round people up. It was more of a long-term project. And there had not been a whole lot of success in forcing assimilation up until the late 1870s. Around that time, though, so there were many people who believed that Native Americans were just destined to die out. that the diseases that had already wiped out so many of them, or the wars, or, you know, just ongoing poverty and other problems would eventually result in the extinction of Native people. And there were plenty of people at that time who were fine with that outcome, sadly. There were a lot of people who thought, well, that's their fate, and we're not gonna, there's nothing we can do about it, and we don't care. But progressives of the time, so like what would be the equivalent today of liberals, they didn't really agree with that sentiment that we should just allow Native people to go extinct. They had an alternative idea, which they thought was preferable, but today is quite a horrifying one to us, which was that instead of outright killing Native people, they would instead kill Native culture, or in other words, like commit a kind of cultural genocide. And this was the idea that propelled the residential school system. The man who said this famous quote, "Kill the Indian and save the man," was the founder and superintendent of the first federal boarding school, which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This is a photograph of what that school looked like. You can kind of see what they were up to there. These types of schools, these residential schools, were created around the same time in the United States, Canada, and Australia, and I think some other English-speaking parts of the world as well. These schools, just overall, what they tended to do was to take children away from their parents at a pretty young age, like around perhaps 6 to 8 years old, and then keep them in a boarding school far from their parents for a set period of years. In the early days, like in the very earliest days that we're going to talk about with the Forest Grove Indian School, it could have been just 3 years or just 5 years. But as time went on, they took children who were younger and younger and kept them for longer and longer. And of course, the project was to take away all of their Native culture and put them in an environment where they had no exposure to it, where their behavior could really be controlled and surveilled. Boarding schools like this were created all over the United States. Eventually, there were 25 off-reservation federal boarding schools. You can see that number 1 in this picture, that corresponds to the Carlisle Indian School, the picture we just saw a minute ago. But if you look way over in Oregon, number 2, that is the Forest Grove Indian School. The second one of these federal schools in the entire country was right here, about a mile from where I am sitting right now. In addition, so that was just the federal off-reservation boarding schools. There were hundreds of other residential schools in the United States. Some of them were boarding schools that were on reservations, and some were other types of schools that were run by church denominations. So the system was pretty vast. And I don't know if you can see on this slide, but it says that there are actually still like 73 of these schools are still open. They're quite different nowadays than they once were. But that just gives you an idea that this is not something that only occurred in the 1880s. It actually like continued to occur for a very long time. The assimilationist policies really continued up through the 1960s. And if you ever have a chance to speak to someone who went to these boarding schools in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, some of the stories I've heard are just absolutely heartrending. And it's truly shameful that our government was involved in this in any way. So as I mentioned, the Forest Grove Indian School was the second one of these federal off-reservation schools in the United States. And this is one of the few pictures that we have today of what it looked like. And again, just reading this picture closely, this is, by the way, what I do as a professor at Pacific, is teach people about like looking closely at historical evidence. So when I look at this picture, I try to look at it very carefully and see what I can read from it. So over on the left, that building that's over on the leftmost side of the picture, that's the boys' dormitory. And we can see the boys are in front of the boys' dormitory. Over on the right, we see the girls in front of the girls' dormitory. The boys, you'll notice, are all wearing military uniforms. The guy standing in front of them, who has a sort of bushy mustache, he's wearing a military uniform. So what's going on with that is that the first superintendent standing there in front, he was an ex-Army officer. That was the case for a lot of the people who ran these schools originally. A lot of them were Army officers who had just recently been part of that whole program of pushing Native people onto reservations. The boys were treated as if they were in a military academy. They had to wear military uniforms when they weren't working, like in the fields. They had to wear military uniforms. They had to do drill. There were buglers calling them to roll call in the morning and so on. So it was sort of like a military academy. The girls, you can see, are mostly wearing aprons, and that's because they were working. The school was partly about learning things like academics, but it was also very much about work and vocational skills. So the girls were doing things like all the cooking for everybody at the school, all the laundry for everybody at the school, and all the sewing for everybody at the school. This was a lot of really heavy work. And then if you look in the background, that building that's kind of shorter in the back, that was the original school workshop. So that's where the boys learned their vocational training skills. So things like carpentry, blacksmithing, shoemaking, and that sort of thing. And then attached to it, the kind of lower building that's sticking out from the workshop, I think that was the bakery. So that would have been a place that the girls worked. This is, by the way, very close to where I live, just a few blocks away. In relationship to Pacific University, where I work, it's about 4 blocks west. I don't know if any of you are actually familiar with Forest Grove, but it's also very close to the downtown, just a few blocks where you see the pack tie symbol down there. That's like the center of our downtown. So very close to the downtown. A common misconception that I hear is that this school was run by Pacific University. It was not. It was run by the Department of the Interior, what is now the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the Department of the Interior. They've run it from day one. They still run it today. But Pacific was very deeply involved in getting it up and running. We donated that land. That's where the blue square is. We donated that to the government. We helped get the school going. We provided teachers. We hired the first superintendent to work at our school. So Pacific, even though we did not run it, we were quite involved in making it happen. But why was it in Forest Grove to begin with? I just wanted to address this because it did seem strange to me when I first started learning about the school. Like, why would they choose to put a school like this in Forest Grove, of all places? Forest Grove only had about 1,000 people back in 1880. We weren't a big town. We didn't have an Indian reservation right next door. So why Forest Grove? Well, the fact that we did not have a reservation close to us was actually one of the reasons why it came here. They wanted to find a place that was far enough away from where the students lived that it would be difficult for them to leave, so that they couldn't run away and go back to their homes. But on the other hand, Forest Grove was also well connected through transportation. So there was a train line that went close by, so they could gather students by road and rail and river and get them to Portland, and then they could easily get on a train that would take them to Forest Grove. So it was like hard to leave if you were running, but easy to gather. And then the other things that were drawing the school here were that we had a strong religious element connected to the Congregationalist church, which, this is going to sound kind of perverse, but the church was interested in like converting Native peoples and was thus seen as sort of a more welcoming environment. Just that so many people in town were actually pretty sympathetic to missionary ideas. So this is a little hard to describe. It was definitely a racist environment, but it was less kind of a hostile racist environment than many other small towns in Oregon would have been at the time. So it was seen as being a little bit more welcoming than kind of the average small town. And then the other piece of everything was, of course, that the university was there. So the university was providing land and providing political support and hiring their superintendent and so on. So it was that sort of combination of our geography, religious elements in the town, and university support that brought it to Forest Grove originally. Speaking of hiring the first superintendent, this is what he looked like. He's kind of a crazy looking guy. He was a very zealous religious person. He was brought up by his father was a circuit riding Methodist minister. So he was an evangelical who tried to get, this was the 1880s. He spent his time doing things like rounding up drunks in downtown Portland and trying to get them to go to the YMCA and repent. So he was a real sort of charismatic evangelical, as well as an army officer. So he's the one who brought the school to Forest Grove originally and began building it. From 1880 to 1885, the school enrolled 310 Native children. This slide, the tribes that had the most children at the school are in the largest font, and those with smaller numbers are in smaller fonts. And so something to notice again is that maybe surprisingly, there were almost no students from the tribe that was originally here, like the tribe that's indigenous to Forest Grove itself, did not contribute actually any children to the Forest Grove Indian School. Only one student from Grand Ronde, which is where all the Kalapuyan tribes were taken. Only one Grand Ronde student attended Forest Grove, and they were from a different tribe, not from the local Atfalati tribe. So they succeeded in getting students from far away, where it was hard for them to run back home. Now, this is a difficult picture to look at. This picture was taken around 1885, and I've included it so that we can kind of think about what these children were going through when they were brought to the school. So these are three little girls. We don't know what their names are. We don't know which tribe they came from. They've been dressed here in sort of cheap matching dresses that were made, I'm sure, at the school. Two of their heads have been shaved, which was probably to combat lice. And you just sort of get a sense in this picture, I think, of like how hard it was for them. Being taken away from their parents when they were like very young, 6 or 7 years old. Not being allowed to speak their own languages. I just can't imagine how hard it would have been. We have very few actual accounts in the first person from students who survived the school. And that's because the school was open so long ago, you know, closed in 1885, that most of the students who survived it had passed away by the 1940s, and just very few of them left a written record of what they had been through. And so in years of looking, I've only found a few first-person accounts from students, and this is one of them. This is one of the Puyallup students who went there, just recalled how the children who came in would cry when their clothes from home, the blankets that they were given by their parents, were taken away from them. When they entered the school, they would be put into the dorms. This is a photo of inside the boys' dorms. And so, again, you can kind of see the similarity to a military school. Looks like a barracks. The boys actually constructed this entire building and all of the furniture themselves. So I just want to point that out, because these schools were always being run on a shoestring budget, and they would use the students' own labor to kind of keep the school running, including having the children build the buildings. This is what the daily schedule was like for the students. So again, kind of like a military academy. Up at 5, roll call, then breakfast. The girls who were in the cooking class, which is one of the vocational classes, they had to make all the food. So the girls in the cooking class were getting up probably even earlier than 5 to start the process of getting breakfast ready. And they had to serve it. After breakfast, half of the class or half of the school would go to academic classes, and the other half would go into vocational classes. In the evening, the boys had to do military drills, and then late in the day, they would sometimes get free time, but other times they were required to go to church in the evenings. And then lights out at 8:30. So very much like a military academy. This photo, this is supposed to show an academic class, but you can see quite easily that this is a staged photo. So like, look at the bottom of the photo. That's grass. So I think what was going on here is that they probably didn't have proper lighting to take a real indoor photo. This was taken by like a traveling photographer from a studio in Portland. So they set up the class outside, and this is supposed to sort of show a tableau of what they were doing in these academic classes. The main thing they were learning was English, just like how to speak English. And then they would also be taught things like the alphabet, reading and writing. And in the back there, we see an organ. They were taught music, which I think was probably one of the favorite subjects of the students, just based on various little clues we have about that. And they were also taught some geography and a little bit of some other subjects. But the main thing was to learn English. Speaking your own language was punished. Here's a photo of what the boys' workshop looked like. So this is that building that was in the middle of that campus photo. And again, this is posed, but this is just demonstrating some of the older students who were enrolled at the time doing carpentry. And similarly with shoemaking, it's the same building. They've just rearranged it to demonstrate shoemaking. And then this is a photograph of the girls. And this is a very interesting photograph because they've arranged it to, again, demonstrate all of the things that the girls were supposed to be learning. So we see, like, over on the left, there's a girl washing with a wash tub, and then there's another 2 people using like a wringer. Then there's ironing, more ironing, there's bread baking, lots of sewing on the right-hand side. Some little girls with dolls who are demonstrating like childcare. And then over on the left, cleaning. And so while the boys' vocational training was, at least in theory, supposed to set them up with skilled trades, the girls' vocational training was really setting them up to be housewives or domestic servants, because things like laundry were some of the only paid jobs that Native women could get at the time. They also were forced to do Christian religious instruction. I just want to mention a sort of a side note that I think some of the attendees at the school were sincere converts to Christianity. So I don't mean to denigrate that faith at all by describing this. But it was compulsory. Most of the students attended the Congregational Church, which is now it's been renamed the United Church of Christ. And just as kind of a little side note, the local people who attend the United Church of Christ today are learning more about this history, and they are just totally horrified about it. And so I just wanted to mention that in case it was a concern for anyone here. I just wanted you to know that they do care. They do care about this history. Of all the things that the children were taught, though, the most symbolically important thing to the school administration was the teaching of farming. And it was mostly boys who were sent out to do the farming work, but some girls had to do it too. The school, while it was in Forest Grove, had kind of a sharecropping arrangement. There was only 4 acres or so actually on the school campus. And so they had sharecropping agreements with area farmers. And what that meant was that basically they sent the children out to work. The children planted and picked, and then the produce was sold to benefit the school and to pay the rent effectively on the farm property. So the children were being worked, basically, in order to support the school. This was symbolically important, though, because one of the things that detractors of the school said was that Native children could never be taught, and that Native people, you could give them a veneer, a thin veneer of education, but that really Native people were not capable of doing things like farming. And so they wanted to show that, oh, actually Native children can learn to do this. And that means that when they go back to the reservation, we can divide up the reservations into individual allotments, give each family a farm, and then they will be self-supporting. They will no longer need their tribes, and reservations will be a thing of the past. So it was not only about making students into farmers, it was about the whole project of kind of breaking down tribal nations and breaking up their land. Was there abuse at the school? I'm going to say yes, there was. Again, with the caveat that we have so few first-person accounts from students that have survived. I would say 99% of the historical evidence that's in writing or, in photographic form that still exists today was created by and for the white people who were running the school. And so they were certainly not, pausing in their log for the day to write down how they had abused the children. This is really kind of invisible in the historical record unless you really kind of read between the lines. And so this was just one letter I was able to find from one of the students who attended in the 1880s, saying that he remembers how the second superintendent would use his fists and number 10s, which is slang for feet, instead of reasoning with the boys. So what he means by that is that he was hitting and kicking the children. And that at one point, this particular student, Henry Cicade, said that he wanted to go on and get more education. He actually expected to get a beating from the superintendent based on that. He didn't, but that kind of tells you a little bit about what the environment was like. On top of that, so we don't have that much written evidence about this one way or the other, But I think we can kind of extrapolate from a lot of other institutional settings. Definitely Indian schools in later days where people have been able to write down their experiences. There are, many, many, many cases of just really horrifying abuse that happened at these schools in later days. But also really, I think, almost any kind of institutional setting where children are not allowed to complain or have no real way to improve things if things are going badly for them. Think, if you were children at this school and someone was treating you badly, how would you stop that from happening? There was nobody at the school who you could complain to. You couldn't write a letter without getting a stamp. Let's say you did somehow write a letter. Who are you going to write it to? Your parents probably can't read or write, and they very likely don't understand English. So you're going to have to write it to a white person at the reservation to read it to your parents. Basically, there was no real way for the students to say anything if something was going wrong. So based on all of that, I would say that it's quite likely that abuse was going on at the school. Possibly worse than that, and this is another sad slide. There were a lot of deaths at this school. So there were 310 students who enrolled, but they didn't all enroll like on day one, right? First year, there were only like 40 students, then 60 students, and then the numbers went up every year. So in the first year or two, there weren't that many students there. But then as time goes on, you get more and more students, the conditions get more crowded, the sanitation gets worse, and students began to die. This has been one of my major projects in researching the school, is really trying to carefully document the deaths, the causes of their deaths, and where they were buried. And a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I was highly, highly worried that all 11 of these students were in unmarked graves somewhere in Forest Grove. Now, happily, I have been able to find out within about the last year, doing additional research, that probably most of them were probably returned to their families in the 1880s. I haven't confirmed every possible case, but it appears that that is likely what happened for the majority of these students, that their remains were returned to their families. The exception being the first 2 students who died, Martha Lott and Victor Hugh, who are still in unmarked graves here in Forest Grove. And I'm part of a small group of people here in Forest Grove who are working on reaching out to the tribes of these students so that we can support whatever tribal decisions or family decisions may be made about those graves.
Eva, we have a couple of questions from the chat. One question is, did the students receive high school diplomas, and was there any kind of job placement after they left the school?
I am going to address a bit of like what happened to students after they graduated.
Okay.
But I'll just say that during the 1880s, they weren't yet trying to give them a high school education. They were trying to give them more or less like an 8th grade education. And so they weren't getting diplomas when they came out, but they did get sort of like a graduation ceremony and some sort of recognition for having gone through. Another side point is that in the very early days, I just want to underline that this is only in the very early days, not how things were in like the 1890s or 1910s or whatever, but just in the early 1880s, children were taken in for a set time period of like 3 years or 5 years. And so they kind of got whatever they could get done within that time frame, rather than like going all the way through a curriculum and then being sent home, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question about Superintendent Minthorn. Scott says, Minthorns are a well-known clan among the Umatillas. Was he related?
No, and I looked into that just because I was curious about it as well. But no, Minthorn is totally unconnected. Minthorn was a Quaker doctor, and his family came from Iowa, and before that from Canada. And I don't think there's any connection to the Minthorns of Umatilla, but that is a really good question. By the way, short side note about Minthorn. His main claim to fame is actually not being the superintendent of the Forest Grove Indian School. He was the first president of what is now George Fox University. And the uncle of President Herbert Hoover. So his house is still standing in Newburgh, and you can visit it today. Anyway, just a short aside about him.
Thank you. And then just a quick question clarifying the tribe that Martha Lott was from.
She was from the band of, her father was Chief Lott of, which was a lower, he was chief of a band of Lower Spokane. And some of their family seems to have gone to Colville in later years, and some of the family went to Spokane. But we've been in contact with both tribes, and it appears that they are considered to be Spokane.
Thank you.
All right. So I just have a few more slides to go, and then we can open back up for more questions. All right. So what happened in 1885? Well, the school left Forest Grove. I could give you a whole discussion on like why and how that happened. It was very political. There was a lot of like, it was a bit like how towns today will try to lobby over who gets the federal prison because it brings in all of this federal money and jobs. And so basically citizens of Salem sort of stole the Indian school and got it moved to 5 miles north of Salem. That's the very, very short version of the story of how it moved. And incredibly, it is still open today. It is one of the few remaining federal off-reservation boarding schools. However, it is absolutely not anything like it was in the 1880s, of course. I also want to say I'm definitely not an authority on what Chemawa is like today. Of course, I do know graduates, I do know people who went there, but I am not really equipped to answer questions about, like, what is Chemawa like today? Or what are some of the problems at Chemawa? I think there may be other people here today who would be much, much better at answering those questions than I am. I can tell you all about the 1880s, not so much about the 2020s. This is the block where the Indian school was. It has been, as you can see from this photo from Google Earth, it has been completely built over. There are no surviving traces, at least visual traces of the school. There are also no markers. So the graves that are left are unmarked and the site itself is unmarked. There's nothing really physically in our town to let people know that the school was here. The people who live on this block mostly don't know what they're living on top of. So what was it like for the students who survived this? So in these early days, students were attending for 3 or 5 years, sometimes longer. During those 3 or 5 years, more so than those vocational trades or the academics, what the school was really trying to do, of course, was to teach assimilation. And so if you can imagine yourself being put into an institution as a child that tells you every day that your home language, your culture, your religion, all of those things are backwards and wrong, Well, it wouldn't be surprising that some students actually absorbed this message, but they didn't usually completely buy into it. Students who entered the school as teenagers or as young adults, which was relatively common in those very early years to have older students coming in, a lot of them were actually plucked out of on-reservation day schools. So they had already been in school for maybe like 5 or 10 years by the time they got to Forest Grove. So they, a lot of times, already knew English. They already could read and write and do math. For those very first students, a lot of them from Puyallup that came in to the school in like 1880, 1881, some of those students were able to use the skills they got at the Forest Grove Indian School to kind of like subvert the purpose of their education and have some pretty positive outcomes. So like, for example, one graduate of the school founded what we think is the first Native-owned bank in the United States. Another student founded an integrated school for white and Native children. Other early graduates became tribal leaders or even elected leaders. But these were not the typical outcomes. And I just want to underline that I think, my sense is that these students who came in as like 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, they had been able to live with their families for most of their lives. So they weren't being exposed to the same level of like institutionalization and trauma that the younger children were. So they, I think, had better outcomes partly for that reason. For a lot of students, when they came home, it was actually like a really, really difficult transition. I read a quote from, some of you may know him, David Jean Lewis, who's from Grand Ronde. He published a paper a few years ago where he talked about one of his ancestors who had gone to residential schools. And he said when he came home, these are his words, he was doomed to spend the rest of his adult life between the two worlds of Indian and white men, battling to explain each to the other and never having an opportunity to just be himself in either place. And my sense is that that was an experience that a lot of students had, that like they had been trained at the school to reject their home culture. But when they left the school, what could they really do? Let's just say for the sake of argument that you went to this school and you decided to assimilate, just for the sake of argument. Well, let's say you come home to Umatilla and you think, I'm going to move to Pendleton. Well, you can't move to Pendleton. You can't leave the reservation without a pass. You're not a citizen of the United States. You do not have the right to vote. The white people in Pendleton won't tolerate someone who's not white kind of moving up economically through the ranks. So for a lot of students after they left, they may have been trained in a trade, but they couldn't leave the reservation to practice it. And so they were sort of trapped in this poverty once they got back home. And a lot of students tried to become farmers, and some of them did, and there were some success stories with students who actually were able to like have really nice farms. But for a lot of students, they couldn't. And, they got home and the reservations a lot of times had been put on poor agricultural land. That was where they were pushed because the white farmers didn't want that land. So trying to farm on that land didn't work out so well. So what can you do? You can't really make a living using your vocational trade because there's nobody who's going to pay you for that. So the kind of work that that people could get was often like migrant farm work. And so a lot of the migrant farm workers in the Pacific Northwest, if you go back, not even that far, like just as far back as like the 1950s, a lot of the migrant farm workers were actually Native people who would move around seasonally and then go back to the reservation periodically. The other types of work that you could get were like domestic labor. Women could make a living doing things like selling baskets. Well, I don't know about make a living, but supplement a living by making baskets. And then there were always things like sex work for the women as well. The men tended to work as migrant farm laborers, road workers, and then depending on where they lived. So in some places, like students who went back to Alaska, quite a few of them became things like fishermen. So in some cases, there were like better things that they could do, but basically the overall story is that while some students were able to kind of, you know, buck the odds and be successful economically, for a lot of students, it was like a serious, serious struggle just to survive after they came out of the school. All right, so this is a lot of heavy stuff. And, you know, as I said at the beginning of the talk, this wasn't just one school, this was part of a system. This is a part of a system that went on for many decades. It's a system that traumatized, in some cases, like multiple generations of the same families. What can we actually do about this today? It's obviously not enough to just say, oh, we're sorry. What can we do? And so I'm gonna put a couple of ideas up on the following slides, but this is not intended to be like a complete catalog of what we can do. And I definitely invite more ideas. So the first thing I'm going to mention is that these residential schools, their reason for being was to erase Native culture, to get rid of it. And so one thing we can do that very directly opposes that goal is to unerase Native culture. So in other words, to support Native culture, to that could be anything from like buying things that were made by Native people to attending Native events. You know, all of those things are good, to even just acknowledging that Native people are still here, that they're not like something that happened in the past that we don't have to think about anymore. You know, Native culture is here, it's vibrant. We should really be like supporting it, participating in it in ways that are appropriate, you know, and so on. Also, we can all support Native sovereignty and treaty rights. And so that can be some really simple everyday stuff like, you know, just like respecting Native people's rights to harvest salmon and those sorts of things. But they can also be like, I'm going to give an example from my own life. My parents live in California, and they live probably just about 5 miles from an Indian casino that was built, you know, pretty recently, like 5 or 6 years ago. And when it was being built, they really opposed it. And they said, like, this is, you know, this is bad for the environment, and we don't agree with gambling, and it's going to bring a lot of traffic. And, you know, they had all these different reasons. But underlying a lot of it was this idea they had that the tribe was just not legitimate. Like, we've never heard of this tribe before. We think they're just trying to get rich. We're not sure what their motivations really are. And so, you know, if you have those thoughts yourself, or if you know people who have them, I think it's worthwhile just to kind of examine that and think like, well, isn't this a sovereign nation making decisions about their own land? Don't they have, we may not agree with all of those decisions, but shouldn't we support their right to make those decisions? So anyway, I just bring that up as one example. Also, so I mentioned that there are these unmarked graves, and that's a really big issue going on right now, is the discovery of unmarked graves all over like Canada and the United States associated with those schools. And so a lot of us who are well-meaning may have the the impulse to go out and try to fix this problem ourselves. Like, how can we, fix the problem of unmarked graves? I just want to argue that we can all support, research and finding and documenting and so on of these graves, but the actual decision on what needs to happen with them absolutely needs to come from the tribes and from the families of these students. And so I guess what I'm saying is we need to support those efforts, but also know when to step back and let other people make the decisions. And then finally, this is something relatively easy that you can do. There are Native-led groups that work directly on the problem of healing from the residential school system. So this is the best known one in the United States, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They have a really good website. They also support things like just healing ceremonies and counseling for survivors of the system. So they're really directly trying to help this problem. And so supporting by financial contributions or, supporting their social media, all of those things I think are helpful to their main mission, which is to work for the truth, healing, and reconciliation of boarding school survivors and descendants. And events like this one are part of that effort, I think, telling the truth about what happened and not hiding it or minimizing it. That is my email address if any of you would like to share more ideas. And with that, I'm going to see if we can open up for more discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eva. That was a very rich and thought-provoking presentation. We do have a few more questions in the chat. Brandon is wondering, are there well-documented accounts of students running away?
I have found just a few. So there were, after the school moved to Chemawa, there were many more students who ran away, maybe because they were right next to the railroad line, so they could just hop on a car and leave. In Forest Grove, I have found one case of this definitely happening. It was actually more Spokane children, so children who came from that same band as Martha Lott. There was a student who, so I have to say, this is according to the white people's account of what happened. But according to what we know, 2 students left the school in the middle of the night, broke into one of the stores in our downtown, stole, I think, $100, then tried to run. They ran all the way to Beaverton. They tried to make it on a train, but students who had been charged with being the sort of the internal police for policing other students, they chased them and brought them back to Forest Grove. And the student who was considered the ringleader of the operation out of the 2, he was 14 years old. He was put in the Oregon State Penitentiary for a year and then sent home.
Diana has a question. Any advice on broaching this subject with my dad's remaining family? I only know what little girl me overheard.
So I might need more context to know what, is this a family of survivors?
That is my suspicion. I know that my father's sister was forcibly sterilized, and I know that she was put into several mental institutions. But that's all family gossip and hearsay. And my father assimilated deeply. We didn't even know he had family until they showed up at our house in the middle of the night, and it would be like, oh, cool, dad's got a brother.
Mm-hmm.
And another brother, and a sister and a mom. And so he was very deep into being married to a white woman and having white children and living that life. His other family members learned to speak Spanish because being Mexican was better than being Indian. Um, and so, and I live far away. Again, these are almost strangers to me, but it's a conversation I think would heal a lot of people if I were to be the one brave enough to open it.
So, of course, I'm a historian and not I don't have like any therapy background or anything like that. So anything I tell you is not going to be like, I'm sure there's other people here who could probably give better advice. All I can say is that I've heard from other people whose families also went through this system that a lot of times it was never spoken of. And I think that that kind of speaks to sort of the shame that people internalized about their own backgrounds, and which is really, really sad. And that, I don't know what specifically you might be able to say with your family, but just, it could be that saying something that opens it up to say, like, this is not something that should be shameful, and we should know what happened, if it's not going to create more trauma.
Well, I think I want to say that I'm almost lucky to be at a time when the people, like, I want to hear other people's stories. So my dad didn't tell me his stories, but maybe his brother will tell me my dad's stories. Tell me stories about your sister. So the people I can now look back on and have a language about and say, whoa, like deep, deep trauma in those specific people, they've all now passed.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm talking myself into this. Thank you for bringing a hard topic to the front and giving us language and giving us permission to go out and collect the stories while they're still available.
Well, thank you very much for sharing.
Adrian and Bernadette want to know, why has the town not put up a marker?
Okay, good question. So there are actually plenty of people. It's not because people oppose it. I just want to put that out there. I think for a long time there was a lot of just ignorance. People didn't exactly know where the school was, for example. I mean, like that is kind of like the level of knowledge that was here in town. We didn't know which block it was on. But in the last few years, once people have learned more about it, I've given talks kind of like this locally a few times. People almost always want to do something, to put something up. And we certainly could go out there and put like a plaque on the ground. I'm concerned about doing that without having input from the tribes whose children attended the school. I don't know whether that's appropriate, whether a different way of memorializing the school would be better, or even whether they'd prefer that it stay erased. I don't know that. And so I'm in a...
Yeah, they don't want anything to be erased. There's like heavy censorship going on. So the more people with the internet can get the word out, the better.
What we're trying to do, I'm in a small group of people who are working to do a systematic outreach to the tribes whose children were in the school, to see if we can bring together some sort of group that would be tribally led, so that we could be sort of like the local on the ground team to help carry out whatever tribal decisions are made. So that's something that's like going on right now, is trying to figure out how to do it. It's a difficult problem because there's, around 24 modern nations that need to be reached out to. So it's a pretty big project just in terms of like communicating. But we do want something like that to happen. Absolutely.
Some reservations are really hard to get to because they don't have internet, so we'd have to drive. It'd be great if you got the school to pay for your gas.
I've had generous people offer money to help.
Yeah, you for sure have to go to the tribe, and that would be a really good thing to document because of the severity of the situation right now. And it would be really good because especially with COVID and the back, like not having insurance, they don't want to go, but they also don't want people to come there. But it's also if they have internet, great. If they don't have internet, then you got to go there.
Yeah. Well, we will be working to try to. I don't want to just be me personally writing to, the tribal chairperson. I want to do it like properly and like introduce myself properly, come with the proper authority, and come with pretty good assurance that we can actually do something and that we're not just coming with words.
Mm-hmm. And Kata, you've had your hand up for a while. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. My name is Kata Autoby. I'm Taos Pueblo in Cheyenne Arapaho. I don't have affiliation with Pacific University, but my partner is currently working on his senior thesis about this subject, and he couldn't be here today, so I was like, I'll fill in for you. But my question mostly, and I know you briefly mentioned it earlier, was kind of the process of finding those unmarked graves and repatriating them, specifically in the context of what's been going on in a lot of the Canadian residential schools. And I guess I'd just like to know a little bit more about how that process might have been started or what it might look like in the future, specifically for the Forest Grove Indian School, just because it's no longer there and there's homes built on top of it now, kind of, where to go from here. Also, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your questions. And by the way, if your partner is at Pacific and ever wants to talk to me, please, please, please tell them to come knock on my door, email me. I'm really happy to talk. But anyway, the whole project, actually, the whole way that I got involved in this to begin with began with the graves. So back, I think 2012 or 2013, something like that. I was working downstairs in the library and the student came up and introduced herself to me. It turns out that she had just graduated from Chemawa and our freshmen have to do like a community service project their first year. So what she wanted to do was to locate the graves of students who had died at the Forest Grove Indian School and basically like clean the graves and spruce them up because she had done something similar at Chemawa. And I was like, oh, we don't know. At that time, I was like, we don't know who the children were. We don't know what their names are. We don't know who died. We don't know who was buried here, and we don't know where the graves are. Like, we basically knew nothing. All we had was a photocopy of the roster from the school that we had copied from the National Archives. That was it. And so I hired that student to work with me in the archives, and we spent the next year transcribing that roster and trying to get started on researching every one of the students on it. And that was kind of how it started. And then there was, as far as like finding where the graves were, that's been a multi-year process. Just to shortcut through some of it, the things that were actually the most useful. So the school rosters would keep track of some of the students who had died, but not all. The place where you really find the information is in the financial ledgers. And that's because anytime the school had to pay for something that was unusual, such as a coffin, it had to be documented, sent to Washington, D.C., and then okayed. And so anytime that we have a ledger, they don't survive for every single year, but when there's a ledger, you can find the record of the coffin being built and expenses related to funerals. And so that's been one of the major sources. The bigger question of like how this is going to relate to a bigger project, some schools like Chemawa have actually been researched for many, many years by historians. And there's actually already been a whole lot of work done on, finding where the graves were, like doing archival research and then also actually doing ground penetrating radar. There's a woman named Marcia Small who did that for the Chemawa Cemetery. And so there has been actually a whole lot of work done on it, but it hasn't been publicized at all, not because we, the workers who are working on this, don't want people to know, but just because we've been like, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to call up? Am I going to call up NPR and say, hey, I'm working on a spreadsheet. Do you want to see my spreadsheet? Like, that's kind of, that doesn't sound like it would be compelling. And so it hasn't been
There's hackers out there stealing their information from the hospital. So you can definitely tell them that stuff, and
so, I mean, the thing is about all of these stories coming out from Canada is that suddenly all of these media outlets are very, very interested in this. And so OPB has been running stories about it. Other newspapers have been running stories about it. So we've been sharing that information with them. And we're getting ready to publish another site that we hope will pull together all the documentation for Forest Grove and Chemawa, which we will then share with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which is sort of like the national level clearinghouse for that info. So I think it'll get done. What's going to be actually a lot harder is the smaller residential schools that are out on reservations. The federal boarding schools have been pretty, I think a lot of investigation has been done, but the individual schools like out at Warm Springs, those are the ones that are really going to have a lot more work to do.
You mean fighting racists out there?
I mean, probably that too, but like just, the real basic work of like, when were the schools open at Warm Springs? How many students went there? Who were the students who went? Like, none of that, as far as I know. Maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I know, a lot of the reservations have not had that kind of detailed level work done on the on-reservation boarding schools.
You'd have to go there.
Scott Raymond, I don't think I understand your question enough to offer it. So would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi. It's basically kind of unrelated, except that I feel like recently, especially for members of the Baha'i religion, we've been told by our National Spiritual Assembly that we need to do a better job of understanding who the Indians are, that they definitely have a different culture, and it's extremely valid. And a lot of what I consider deep Indian culture comes from perceptual places that are completely different than what we've understood as European descendants and American descendants. And it's valid, and it's valid in ways that it's uplifting, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful, and it's shocking that we've missed it. And I want us to, I want people to take the opportunity to understand what these people actually have to offer us, because we have been told specifically as Baha'is that they have things to offer us that we don't understand yet. So I was asking if the book specifically was the Book of Hopi by Frank Waters. Do you assimilate knowledge that comes out of books like that? How do you, what do you do with it once you've read something like that?
I mean, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that. It sounds like
if anybody is.
A question for other Baha'i people. So if anybody else wants to jump in with a response, please do. I'm going to be silent for just a second here.
That's okay. You don't have to have an answer for every question, Eva. It's all right.
I'll say a short comment on it. I think it's really good to try to appreciate like other worldviews and get a sense of how completely different yet valid a different worldview can be, how much we can actually incorporate that into our own work, and how appropriate that is. That's kind of like another question. Like, would it be right for me to try to absorb the worldview of a specific tribe and then apply it to what I'm telling you. I'm just not, I have questions about whether that would be right or not.
Thank you. Have you been able to locate any graves in Forest Grove?
Yes, and so there are two. They're both in the town cemetery, which was a huge relief. At the beginning of the project, I was worried that they might be under those houses. I've found no evidence that they are actually on that residential block. The burials that were done here in Forest Grove appear to have all been done in the town cemetery. And two of them appear to still be there. There were several other children who look like, from the financial records, that their families actually requested back in 1884, that their coffins be exhumed and sent back home. And so there's only, and other ones I think were sent home right after they died. And so there's only two that I've been able to reasonably well confirm are still in the graveyard here, but we know where they are. We know the plots. They're just unmarked. They don't have a marker on them, but we know where they are.
And has there been any pressure from tribes or local officials to exhume these grave sites? That's a question from Kata.
So, okay, I just want to first of all, if the tribes request that it happens and they have proper authority, we're going to be, that's going to be something we're supporting. We're not trying to stand in the way of that in any way. Secondly, we would not allow, at least I can't say I wouldn't allow. I don't have the ability to allow or not allow people to do things, but the mayor of our town is aware of this situation and he wants to support outreach to the tribes whose children these are, to make that decision, and that outreach is underway now.
Great. And Brooke, would you like to unmute and ask your question or make your comment? You're still muted, Brooke. There you go.
I am a Baha'i, and I was interested in the question that was posed a few minutes ago, as well as everything else that I've been listening to. And I can answer as a Baha'i, what I can say is that we are encouraged to focus on social and economic development in the world and locally and so on. And I think when it comes to this issue, just like the Black Lives Matter issue, that I've been participating in some race unity studies, that we need to find out from the tribes. We need to be educated, number one. We need to find out what they feel, what they would like us to do, and how, and try to figure out how we can fit that in, because it's not up to us to go to any group and with the attitude that we want to fix it from our point of view. And I think that that's something that's happened in society and in the past with different things. And I think we're learning that that isn't a very successful approach. And I would be very interested in being involved in anything that moving forward that could be of value.
Thank you. So we are coming up on 8:30. So we'll take one more question from Jennifer. And then we will conclude our formal program, but people are welcome to stay and continue to chat after the formal program concludes. So Jennifer, would you like to unmute yourself and
Okay. So are the owners of the homes that are sitting on the property where the school was, are they all aware of the history?
No, they're not. I've given talks like this locally a few times, and once or twice I've had people say like, oh, I used to live on that block. I had no idea what was happening. And I don't think, like, I've certainly never gone and knocked on doors on that block. And I do wonder, you know, if the decision is made that we should have some sort of marker on the property, whether there will be any kind of NIMBYism. I hope not. I think it's in the interest of everybody to just know what was there. But as far as I know, I don't think they know what was there.
Okay. Partly I asked the question because I'm really sensitive to energies. And so I just wondered partly too, if anyone's in communication with you from that property and experiencing any kind of.
Yeah, that I do not know.
Okay.
And I think as the process goes on more with, you know, whatever happens next with memorializing the site, we may hear more about that.
Okay, thank you.
You'd probably want a psychic that knew which language they were speaking to, because the language has been erased.
Okay, so that we're at the conclusion of our formal program. Again, you can hang around and continue to chat if you'd like. I would like to extend our deep thanks to Eva for coming and speaking with us this evening. It's been a wonderful presentation. Thank you to all of you for coming and for your support of our events and our programs. I will give you a little sneak peek for October's event. We will have Dr. Christine Dupree presenting in October, and she is the author of the book, I Am Cowlitz. And she will be speaking about her Native heritage and that connection with our beautiful land in the Pacific Northwest. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Eva. Thank you all for your support, and we will see you next time.